it seems to me that, yes, I can empathize with this idea of not knowing where you belong exactly. I think this idea of unbelonging is part of that, you know. You belong to a place, but also you're not sure where you are. And I'm reminded of the word nostalgia, which we talk a lot about, which the diaspora often has, often through film, literature, food. You have a nostalgic and romanticized image of the home that you left. But indeed, nostalgia comes from the root of it is nostos in Greek, which means home. So I think that this idea of we're always journeying home in a sense, and I think writers understand that. All writers do that, whether it's the home of your childhood or not. As a professor, I would just say that I was talking to Pranesh earlier about this, that the whole way we categorize literature is a problem, I think. It's partly for marketing, but if you take one of these trendy writers, who's a very good writer, of course, Jhumpa Lahiri, for example, she calls herself an American writer. She doesn't want to be termed a diasporic or something else. Most writers that I teach in postcolonial studies do not call themselves postcolonial writers. So I think this question of what home is very complicated. And in fact, I would just end by saying that we often talk about part of this is also this idea of east-west, north-south, these sort of categories for writers. And it's really hard to make those distinctions in our modern world today. So there is definitely a roots that you have, but it also, another thing would be generations, what generation you are, of course. So I'm sure they'll have more to say on this.
Well, I would like to say that I grew up in Orissa, in Cuttack, got a scholarship to Oxford, and I thought India was my home for a very, very long time. And then the longer you live away, you realize that you are also responding to global experiences, you know, and then slowly you do respond to, as a writer, I don't, as he said, I don't see myself as a diaspora writer, or I don't really think. You just write as a poet, the poems come to you and you write, and they're always about issues that you're passionate about, that move you, and you have something to say, because you can't write about things you really don't have a lot to say. So home, the concept of home changes, I think. You know, I sometimes feel that homelessness is more an issue, because when you think about it in the world today, there are actually more displaced and homeless people, and they have been displaced and made homeless by all sorts of reasons, by their own governments or history, or in my case, I went to study and I stayed on. I wanted to come back to India, but believe it or not, I couldn't get a job here. I had a DPhil in English from Oxford, and this was a long time ago, and I had to pay my bills. So I went into investment banking because that was the only job I got. So life takes its own path, and we create our own Indias, where we live. So my India would be very different from the second generation Indians. It's the first generation Indians who have been abroad, so the poets who live there. They have a completely different experience to the Indians who were born there. So it's a very sort of diffuse kind of subject. So one has to be more specific, and I think at this point I will hand over to Pranesh.
If you'd like to add to that.
Yeah, the only thing I'd like to add, I echo pretty much what both my panelists have said here. The thing that I will say is that you can take the Indian out of India, but it's very difficult to lose your Indianness completely. So regardless of where you are, which part of the world, whichever part of the world you are in, and regardless of how long you live outside of the country, there's still that Indianness in you. You never become the other. You never become something else. You're still Indian.
So what I'm trying to get to is that the way in which the diaspora is writing about India can be very different from the way Indians are writing about India, Indians who are based in the homeland. So if you can delve into that, and what are some of the themes that comes across in those writings? For example, V.S. Naipaul always talks about there's a wound, you know, the migration or the displacement has led to a permanent wound. And if you look at Bharati Mukherjee then, or even like Monica Ali in Brick Lane, there's always this going back home kind of phenomena. You know, the main character, her father, I can't remember the name right now, but he always wants to go back to India, you know. So it's a temporary construct which acts as a buffer to all the realities of pain and hardship and nostalgia and other things in the West. So I'll give it to Professor Johnson.
Well, just based on what I know in my experience, yeah, I was thinking of recently. I was talking to Indian Mauritian friend of mine, and so to her, for sure, India is home in many ways. Even though it was her great grandparents who went to Mauritius as laborers, and that has its own layers of class and social attributes that are pretty complicated, apparently. What I was going to say is that she was telling me how her own children, who are the oldest might be as maybe 40, are very much proud of being Mauritian. You know, that is to say, they don't see themselves as they don't have quite that tie that she does, even though she herself, you know, had been 3 generations in Mauritius. I wonder if something has to do with the way in which globalization has taken hold, in the way in which our internet age has made that longing perhaps less acute. But in the days of ships, when you had to take a ship, most of the time when you said goodbye to someone, you may never see them again. Then the jet age, you know, you would see them, but even then it wasn't so frequent. But now with Skyping your friends, you know, and I'm generalizing, I'm simplifying, but basically I think that looking at my friends of a certain age and seeing the differences in the last 30, 40 years in how their children view themselves. I also have another friend who's Indian descent in Trinidad, and the same issue. So the same experience. They see themselves more almost as global citizens.
India is available in the lounge rooms of people through television, through internet, and I think that makes a difference. So it's no longer a construction of the imagination or construct of the imagination as it was maybe 30 years ago to the likes of Naipaul and all that. I'll give it to
I would like to sort of reflect on my own experience because that's what I know best. When I went to do my research at Oxford, I actually wanted to do it on Shakespeare, as every Indian scholar went to Oxford thinking they would write their thesis on Shakespeare. But then I was told by my professor there that so much has already been done that it will be better if you want to complete your work in 4 years or 3 years, whatever the scholarship was for. It's better to go and choose a topic that's more defined. And the writer he thought I should work on was an English novelist, and I just thought, no, I would like to do something different. And I ended up sort of working on the Indian influence on Western poets. So it started with Emerson to Eliot, and there was enough material to do my thesis on just Emerson. Then, as I said, there were no jobs in teaching, so I ended up in finance, and I was asked to look at emerging markets. And I set up the first India Country Fund. This was when India was not open. So a lot of money came into India. But because I think of my passion for India too. So, and then everybody sees you as an Indian and say they put you in that box as an Indian woman, black. So these are the sort of boxes in which you are put. But when you are writing or expressing yourself, you don't put yourself in any of those boxes. diaspora or whatever. And the things have changed so much. I mean, now that NRI money is not required, attitudes to NRIs and persons of Indian origin abroad has changed dramatically. And the recent demonetization is a very interesting example of that, how there's a huge discrimination between that. But we are here on a slightly different issue. But the other thing worth interesting for me is that India is changing so dramatically that my nephews and nieces, they live in a completely different India than the India I knew. So I wrote a novel 2 years ago, and there I tried to capture the Orissa, the Orissa I knew, because they won't believe me when I said how different it was. And so I find that absolutely fascinating. I come every year to India, and when I was investing in India, I spend more time here than abroad. And it's absolutely, but some things are changing here quite dramatically, and some things are not. So I just wish and hope that India picks up more of the good things in the West and holds on to the good things in India. But I'm a bit worried that the opposite might be happening. So
I understand what you said about Naipaul and how he was talking about wounds. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that India was then a very distant dream. They were so far away. There was a lot of angst and yearning. Today's Indian writers outside of this country can easily come to India. There's lots of communication. So there's not as much of the yearning element that you would see in the writers of the past. So because of that, I think our focus has changed away from being strictly Indian in our approach to writing or the themes, and going towards more universal themes that might appeal across countries and across borders. And I think that is the one significant change that has happened because of globalization.
Speaking of globalization, so we've had the internet age, and that has made the boundaries less blurred. But on the other hand, the boundaries have become a bit, as we view the events in the States and Europe and things like that, we can see the world is becoming flatter rather than round. So how do you see that affecting writing? If you had to delve into that, in the crystal ball into the future, the changes happening in the world today, the strengthening of the biased attitudes, I would say, sort of going into the shell pretty much. And the reason I ask that is because there is an attack on freedom of speech throughout the world. There's an attack on tolerance. There's an attack on being different. So if you're in the hyphen space, you're in the third space, it's going to become more and more difficult for diasporic writers to actually get published in that space, I think. If you haven't been published and you want to actually get, you're starting out, you have a child, 20 years old, he or she writes, do you think they can get published in this environment in the West? It'll become harder and harder because there's a certain right-wing bias existing. So I'll give it to you, Alan.
Yeah, I would say that I totally agree that it's obvious that there's this hardening of positions. My take is that, which is tragic. However, my take is that those positions are there precisely because the world has changed. And you see people retreating into their corners in a desperate attempt to keep a mythical world. So, for example, Trump, trying to hold on to his constituency. But I think it's precisely because the world has changed. So I don't see that we can turn the clock back. I also think when I look at the books that sell, if you're talking now about specifically, say, books that are about other countries that sell in the West, in America, there's a huge thirst and hunger for that. I don't know if it's thirst or hunger, which metaphor works better. But those books are the ones that are still very popular. And I should say that, yes, there's been a danger of exoticizing it, but I see that getting better and better. Because the other thing we have to remember, cultures change, and as you were saying, or as others have said, even in the West, knowledge of, for example, Hindi films, food, things, Bharatanatyam, these things are much more developed now than they were 30 years, 40 years ago. And so I think that also you have a readership that understands that more. So my students, definitely they're still very naive and so on in many ways about the world. But the good thing is that they're much more open to new ideas, I think, than their parents. So I think we sometimes, in my view, we tend to think that the narrative is that the pendulum, it's not a zero-sum game. In other words, it's not like we've been in one place and suddenly we've swung back. I think that we're actually, I think there's a lot of optimism there. I think, unfortunately, in the short term, these politicians are getting in the way of that.
My take on this issue would be that writers always will write what they feel they really need to write about, because it's at the end of the day, it's trying to express your imagination, your soul, your passion, and so the world is your oyster in a way. So with so many things going on, but India is in a stage of evolution and growth itself. There's a lot of change going on here, and it's so dramatic in a way that it's, to some extent, it is also generational. So a young writer writing today will have a completely different take on an older writer who's still writing today. So again, it's very diffuse and very individual and very specific, and I still feel that writing will go on, and I do worry about that issue about publishing, which you raised, is that it is getting harder. But the good thing is that there's the internet. The reason you actually need a good publisher is that they hopefully will publicize you. But if you're a poet, you get no help there. So really, books don't sell, people don't buy poetry books. So it's basically, we're talking of novelists and other sort of, because poets have a very difficult time even getting their poems published, and they do publish, but getting a book published takes a very long time, and then if it doesn't sell, and then the publishers, it's sort of chicken and egg, because if the publishers don't sell you, then books don't sell, and then if they don't sell, they say, well, we can't publish you because your books don't sell. So, but I think the internet is providing some scope for people with blogs and all that. People are expressing their views, and you can do that. But again, how many blogs will you read? I mean, you're an active blogger, and you can't spend your entire day reading other people's blogs. So it's this kind of filtering as to what do you read. So then you have publishers have created all the literary prizes and all that. That's one way of filtering. So I think in the end we hope that if you are a disciplined and determined writer, you will come through. Some parts are harder than others, but you shouldn't just give up because you can't find a publisher. Because if you're a true writer, I feel you write regardless of whether it is published or not. I know it's asking a lot, because how can you keep on writing if nobody publishes you? But I think at the end of the day, even I sometimes feel like that. Okay, I'm writing this because, when you're writing, you don't know. I mean, if you write, I've written books on finance, so that's a completely different issue. But when you're writing creative, writing a novel or poetry, you really don't know how it will be received. So it's a very risky sort of business.
Yeah, I think your question was also about the current situation versus suppression of writers. Speaking from the point of view where I live, which is in the United States, there was a lot of worry because Trump came to power. I have a lot of writer friends. I belong to a very vast network of writers on the internet, and there was a very palpable sense of loss and of pessimism. They were ready to give up writing because they felt that nobody would listen to them. Because after all, writing is a way to have your people listen to your thoughts. And there's this very famous journal called the Kenyan Review. They sent out a call for writers who wanted to express what they felt post-election. And all of a sudden, when somebody as reputed as the Kenyan Review does that, all of a sudden it shook writers up, and they're like, it doesn't matter if nobody reads what I'm writing, but I am going to write this, and eventually it'll find an audience. So that's what it did, and I found that this became very infectious, and a lot of people started writing, and a lot of other journals started publishing people who wanted to express their innermost feelings about, the suppression of their thoughts and their writing, and pretty much anything they wanted to say about the election. So yes, there might be this sense of fear, but there's also a sense of support that there's always freedom available to writers to be able to express their thoughts.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Sudha. The point I'd like to emphasize on is that in the past, it was very hard to make a living as a writer, and I think it still is very hard to make a living as a writer. You have to do other things. Like in your case, you have to do investment banking. In my case, I have to do law. And in your case, you have to teach. And we go on and on. So it's still very difficult to be a true writer like V.S. Naipaul was. He had followed no other profession apart from writing. And he was doing that in the 1950s in the West. So imagine what sort of tenacity he had to be a writer. I think the natural progression from here is to use this sample and see what the diaspora thinks of India. I mean, on one side we have this argument that India has changed. Has it? I mean, we're looking at women's rights, we're looking at the abuse of animals and all those sorts of things. Has it really changed? I mean, inequality, poverty. I mean, 20 years ago, was India safer than it is now? Is it or not? So I'd like to give it to Professor Johnson.
Oh yeah! Wow. Has India changed? I might let my co-panelists answer that with more informative content. But even if whether it's good and bad, and for all countries it's a mix, isn't it? That is still a change, But I don't know. I'm not sure where I stand in terms of what the overall. It sounded like what you were asking is the overall, and also what you said, Sudha, is the sense that writers have about the times in which we live as being more perilous and more suffocating, perhaps, and oppressive. Is that something that we feel, despite all these modern comforts that we enjoy? Is that something that is a side product of that? And I definitely do think that there's a consumerist angle. I'm not sure what your take on it is. That hyper-consumerism, like in America, where marketing and so forth can take hold. But having said that, it's interesting how writing always thrives in the most difficult times. And I think people have that desperate yearning, and that's a truism, and I think it is true, and people have a yearning. Also music, the arts in general, thrive when things are most difficult. I mean, some of the great novelists from in the U.S. Were African-American writers from the 1940s, well, even before that, from the Harlem Renaissance in the 20s and 30s, and on, who were Harlan Ellison, not Ellison, but we've got, people writing, and up to Toni Morrison today, and even the Booker Prize winner Paul Beatty, who are responding to, very, very complex changes. In some ways, you would look at the changes and say, be totally demoralized. But on the other hand, you can see some, positives in that mix. So I'm not sure where I would come out on that in terms of where writing is. I still would hold to what I said earlier, that at least the community of people who read, I wish more politicians read, but at least in the community of people who read, it seems that there is that I'm very optimistic about. I think getting published is hard, marketing is there, but as you said, as Shanta said, the writers will write, and even if they don't all get published, some of them will, and I think that's bodes well. I don't know if I really addressed your question. Yeah.
The point I make is that if India rises, then it probably does help, Indian writers. It gives a market out there. So what are the preconditions for that? And it seems to be that we might be actually growing at 7% or whatever, but is it really filtering down to the, further down the trickle, so to speak? Are we addressing, the space that China has occupied in the West, and Chinese writing is coming up at the expense of Indian writing? I think, if you look at, it's the translation and all that, if you go to countries like, in Asia or Australia, New Zealand, there's not much emphasis on Indian writers. They have all these organizations set up which promotes Chinese writing. The entire Australian economic growth is China focused, as a determinant. So, So what I'm trying to make the point here is that, if India doesn't rise the right way, then we have an issue. We have an issue for writers. We have an issue for society.
Again, I'll sort of have to give an individual perspective. I think India has always been a place of contradictions, and yes, things have changed, and I feel nothing has changed. Every year, by November, I feel really fed up. I live in London, and when I went there, it was difficult to find people of color. They use that word. I have faith that people will continue to write. I don't think they will write differently, but it will carry on. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm a little baffled by the question, honestly, because I'm trying to see where you were getting with this question. Were you trying to say that if the economy is really powerful, then there are more writers and more successful writers? In that case, India has always had very, very strong, good writers, even when times were not good. And some of them are very famous. I mean, we've had Tagore, we've had Premchand. So I would not equate economy with writing, if it makes any sense. Yes, you want to add to that?
The reason I make that point is because publishing is a business now everywhere. Yeah, so,
So yes, it is a business. So the problem with making it a complete business is that you're trying to sell something, so you're writing to sell instead of writing what you really feel. So a true writer writes what they feel regardless of whether it's going to sell and make money or not. If it makes money, great. If it doesn't, I know it sounds very idealistic. Yeah, well, maybe I can afford, some people say, yeah, sure, you can just sit there and be idealistic. But then most writers do write because they want to. They really don't write because they intend to make money. Nobody sits down and says, I'm going to make $1 million, right?
I think in the last 5-10 years, the world has become more Chinese. So I think that's a reality we have to live with. I'm actually going to change track a little bit before we go to the audience and finish up with asking the panelists who their favorite writer is or poet. And for any budding writers out there, what advice would you give?
Another tough question. I'm not one of those that has a single favorite, but for poets, I would say I enjoy C.V. Cavafy, who was a Greek-Egyptian poet, who is in translation, in very good translations. And if you're looking, one of my favorite poems is Ithacas, plural. And he's a Greek-Egyptian poet, so he wrote in modern Greek. and he had a different take on the Odyssey. So he was, it was very, I think, global in a sense.
Well, I don't. I have too many favorites, so I can't specify one. And for advice to young budding writers is read a lot, and try to find out what is it that you really like. Find your own voice and keep writing. Even if you don't get published, hopefully one day you will.
You asked about favorite authors. Oh, yes. I have the same problem. Indian writers. I would say Jhumpa Lahiri. If you ask me, generically speaking, writers, Harper Lee has been an enduring favorite since I was about 9 years old. I still read her even today, so that I would say that's my all-time favorite. To Kill a Mockingbird. Any advice? Oh, I have a slightly optimistic scenario to present in terms of publishing. If you like to explore online literary journals, there are a million of them. So it's fairly easy to get published online if you write short stories and flash fiction. Now, if you want to write a book and get it published, that's a whole different story. But again, there's also the online versions, the e-books that are a little bit easier to get published than a regular paper book.
Thank you, everyone. Are there any questions from the audience? And if we can start with a survey.
My question is to Shanta. Shanta, you come from a part of the world which produces highest per capita published poets, that's Odisha. I recently met Mr. Jayant Mahapatra in Jaipur Literature Festival. My question to you is that what comes more naturally to writing in Odisha, Odia language, or in English language? And what is the kind of future for Odia poetry outside Odisha and India? Just like, and what are the kind of audiences that you address when you write English poetry resident in London? Thank you.
Yeah. I've sort of belonged to that generation where I think aspiring Indian parents would send their children to English speaking schools. So I went to St. Joseph's Convent. So though I spoke Oriya and English both at home, in home we spoke Oriya. I never actually wrote when it came to my creative writing. It has always been in English. So I don't know, I wish I could write in Oriya, but I've always written in English. Now, for Oriya writers who have always written in Oriya, the market is limited to Orissa. So unless they are translated well, so the one big issue with India is that we don't have good translators. Well, we have translators, good translators. Maybe we need more good translators. So this is a scheme. I think the Sahitya Academy has made some progress, but a lot more has to be made. I mean, if you look at the West, in the number of translations of Rilke's poetry or any writer, they just don't have one. They have several. So we haven't reached that stage in India. So I hope that will happen, that more and more people. So the thing with English is that you instantly get a global market. But a person who writes in Oriya or any other language, they may not have access to that, unless they're translated. And as far as, what was the third bit of the question? Oh, when I write, again I said, I don't know, I think maybe I'm
Are they just diaspora, or it's mainstream, or it's a multicultural? I mean, when you write, what kind of milieu do you, or an audience do you have in mind?
I don't think I really worry too much about the audience. I think I'm more propelled by the things I have to say. And then once it is written, I would send it off to various editors. I rarely have editors said that you must change, in poems, In a novel, it's slightly different when you're thinking of, but you have more time to deal with it. So I don't think, because I'm not a commercial writer, you see. So I've written commercial books, but they're completely different. In my creative work, it's more self-expression, things that I want to say, and that's the problem maybe, that because that if you think, but then it's very difficult to think of a large audience of the whole world and write. Usually people write in isolation. I don't go to any workshops or anything. You write in isolation. It's a very difficult task actually. So to that extent, writers need an audience, and I think that builds up. And it's a mutual process, because even readers, sometimes you might write a poem having something in mind, and the reader might bring a completely different set of experiences to it. The same might happen in other kinds of writing. I don't know if this answers your question, but that's my...
Do we have any other questions? Anyone else? Okay, if we don't, I'd like you to all thank our panelists by giving a round of applause. Thank you.